Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Legal HR Summit. The Legal HR Summit is a two-day online event hosted by Jus Laboris, the largest employment law alliance in the world. This session is part of the Americas bloc and will be followed by other curated sessions of the region. I am then turning over to Ignacio Funes de Rijoa to begin the session. Go ahead, Ignacio, you can start.
Thank you very much, Annie. Hello to everybody. It's a pleasure being with you today. We have a very interesting topic to discuss with a very professional panel. We have Tara from Canada with us. We have Kia from the US. We have Catalina from Colombia and myself from Argentina. We are all part of the Jus Laboris Alliance of law firms that are part of the International Alliance. And we will discuss how the pandemic and the economic impact of the pandemic has affected the companies operating in our region, and how companies have taken different measures that were available in order to survive in this challenging scenario. So to this end, we will understand restructuring in a broad way, not only terminating people or laying off, but also a creative way in ways where you could reduce workday or salaries or whatever is possible. But we will not go on a country by country typical, can you do this or that, but we'll go more to the hot topics on each country, what each jurisdiction allows more and does better in order to adapt to this crisis. So we will start from north to south, and there I would ask Tara to let us know what's going on and what happened around the pandemic for companies in Canada.
Thank you, Ignacio. Hi, everyone. Hello from Canada. My name is Tara Erskine. I'm a partner with Matthews Dinsdale, which is Canada's only coast-to-coast labor and employment law firm. Hope everyone is doing okay in this very strange time. I'm speaking today from the Atlantic Canada bubble on Canada's east coast, which is one of the safest places to be in the world, and certainly in the Americas, we have one of the lowest rates of COVID. So we're very restricted though in our bubble. I know that it's been a really challenging time for HR professionals and in-house legal counsel, and many of you who I speak with and deal with on a regular basis report that you're working harder than ever before, longer hours, and really challenging issues that you've never before encountered. And laws are changing almost on a daily basis. And so it's been a lot of work to keep up on everything. So I'm just going to talk about the situation in Canada and how Canadian employers are grappling with the issues that COVID has created. And I wanted to thank Jus Laboris for organizing the Congress, and also say hi to my colleagues here. When we had a call the other day and getting ready for this panel, we were remarking how we missed seeing each other in person, and many of us had planned to go to the Congress in Berlin, and of course that was canceled. That was supposed to happen in May. Talk about Canada. So for those of you who aren't aware, in Canada, employment law is primarily provincially regulated. So we have a total of 14 different jurisdictions. So 10 provinces, 3 territories, and 1 federal jurisdiction for the small percentage of employees who are federally regulated. Each jurisdiction has its own statutes, employment law statutes, human rights statutes, and each has addressed COVID in a slightly different way. And so my comments will just be about general trends. The primary way that employers in Canada have been dealing with restructuring amidst COVID was first to conduct mass layoffs of employees as a temporary measure to address things until the company was able to sort out if the company was going to be able to reopen, if it was required to be closed by law. In the hospitality industry, daycares, things like that, that were ordered to be shut, or for businesses that were open, but their business had dried up, for them to decide if the business was going to return to the previous levels. And so in March and April, I was working with employers and processing literally thousands of employees being laid off from their employment. So really unprecedented levels of layoffs. And there are different approaches and challenges depending on whether the employees are unionized or non-unionized. Canada's rate of unionization for private sector employers is at around 15 to 18%. And for unionized employees, layoffs are a little bit easier because generally the terms of notice and how you issue layoff notices is addressed in the collective agreement. Unionized employers, mostly there is a wage schedule or wage increases that have to be paid no matter what. I have not encountered a collective agreement yet that has addressed a kind of pandemic situation or really extraordinary event that would relieve the employer from making the wage increases. So many unionized employers were required to approach their unions to enter into negotiations to see if they could put a temporary stall on scheduled wage increases or do other things, maybe shorten the terms of layoffs, lengthen them, abbreviate the amount of notice that had to be required, things like that. So that was really an issue of negotiation. Now, for non-union employees, this means layoffs meant providing the notice of layoff for the required period of time under the applicable employment standards legislation, which is generally a period of a number of weeks. And there are also provisions for what's called mass or group termination provisions. If you're laying off a high number of employees, you may be required to give higher notice to all of those employees in that group, regardless of how long they've worked with the employer. So what we saw in March, April, May, most provinces amended their employment standards legislation to allow for a longer period of temporary layoff before the employer was required to treat it as a dismissal or a termination of employment. So as an example, in Ontario, under the Employment Standards Act, a temporary layoff normally cannot exceed 13 weeks. And after someone's been laid off for 13 weeks, you either have to recall them to their employment or you have to give them notice of termination, pay in lieu of termination, statutory severance for that. But the legislation in Ontario was amended so as to not count the period of notice during the provincial state of emergency. So it really acted as suspending the clock on those layoffs. And that clock has really just been lifted last month. And so for a 6-month period, the time stopped. And so now employers in Canada are grappling with, are we able to bring back employees? And if not, are having to terminate their employment and pay the associated notice of termination. I think that's my time. I've been timing myself. I just want to say one quick word before I finish, and that relates to constructive dismissal. In Canada, there's no common law right of layoff. And so a layoff may or may not be considered constructive dismissal. And so employees may be entitled to notice of termination, which in Canada can be up to 1 month of pay for every year they've been employed. And that's the same with wage rollbacks, reduction in hours, reduction in wages, change in duties. All of those things can give rise to constructive dismissal claims. So that's what we're watching now. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. Thanks a lot. Very clear. And now I'd like to move forward to the US, not talk about the elections right now, but talking about what's going on relating employees and labor and how our companies are dealing with COVID. Please, Kia, go ahead.
Thanks, Ignacio. Maybe we'll get to the election at the end if we have some time, but everything's still up in the air, as folks who have been watching us probably know. So my name is Kia Denner. I'm a partner at Ford & Harrison, and I'm primarily working out of our New York and New Jersey offices. But certainly I've dealt with coronavirus issues across the country. And so I think when we talk about, what's the hottest topics that we've dealt with and what are the most pressing concerns for companies, much like Tara said for Canada, the issue we have in the United States is we really have 50 different jurisdictions because we haven't had any type of real federal response to what you can and can't do in terms of terminating your workforce. Now, We have on the books for many years, we've had the WARN statute, which is a federal statute, and that basically deals with mass layoffs. And there are some exceptions for WARN in terms of national disasters and emergencies that could have come into play. And that's really what we were all thinking about back in March when it came to the response for all our clients. What are we going to do? And when you had especially multi-state employers coming forward, and that's really been the biggest challenge, is when you have companies that operate maybe in 25 different states. So yes, you have this federal WARN statute that will talk generally about thresholds, will define what a mass layoff is, generally, either it's 500 employees or 50 or more, that constitutes a third of the workforce. I'm not getting into those details at the moment, but the point is that not only did you have to look at the federal law, but if you do have these multi-state employers that are in 25, 30, maybe all 50 states, you actually have to look at each individual state, and you have to look and see if there's legislation in each state for what we would call a mini WARN Act. So for example, New Jersey had a very progressive mini WARN Act that actually was supposed to take effect right in the middle of when the pandemic blew up. And so one of the more challenging things for us as employment lawyers has been to look in each jurisdiction and find out, what's going on, what's the thresholds, and what does it mean? Can you give advance notice? And many clients, many companies were faced with the fact that they had to close their doors almost immediately as a result of local orders to shut down. And again, I can't stress it enough. In the United States, those shutdown orders were not coming from President Trump and the federal government. Those shutdown orders are coming at the local level, mostly on the governors of each individual state. And then it was up to state legislatures to pass laws around that. So, and of course, I probably should have started out with this, but unlike I would think many other countries, in the United States, the general rule is at will employment. So, which basically means, wow, we have this pandemic. We're hurting. People are not coming in. We're getting zero revenue in. So what are we going to do? We're going to fire folks. We're going to lay folks off. There's really no federal statutes aside from WARN, which basically just talks about giving advance notice. There's really no other impediments for private sector employees and employers, right? So most companies were free to do what they felt they needed to do. Now, of course, there was a federal response in terms of the CARES Act, which talked about basically, giving loans and floating businesses along so that they didn't have to make those hard decisions necessarily back in March and April, and to, fire large swaths of their workforce. And in fact, there was a financial incentive to keep your payroll intact so that you can take advantage of these essentially forgivable loans. But those programs are, by this time, they're pretty much all up. So we've had folks coming back now, and I know that we don't know what's happening with the election yet, but depending upon what shifts, how this shifts along, we may be looking at new legislation. Certainly, they've been talking about new legislation to help businesses, and maybe even to give immunity to companies who had to make these hard decisions and make these terminations, so that they're not faced with an avalanche of lawsuits saying we got fired for unfairly because of the pandemic, or perhaps people who did have COVID or were affected by COVID. So, there's been talk of that. We don't have any of that yet on the federal level. But again, the challenge is looking through each individual state, seeing if there are some state laws there that would protect those types of layoffs, or put people in protected classifications that they wouldn't normally be in because of the situation with COVID. For example, folks that have kids whose schools closed because of COVID, normally if, there might not be a spot to fit them in if they didn't qualify for FMLA. So we have to look at that. And we did do that on the federal level. We had the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. But again, a lot of those measures, when you look at what's happening today in the United States, that's not really helping workers right now, and it's not really helping employers at the moment, and dealing with this next wave. So that's where we're at.
Thank you so much, Kia. Very, very interesting. We'll come up with some questions, and please remember there's a Q&A application here in the Zoom. You can send your questions for the end of our initial thoughts to discuss with the audience whatever is needed. Catalina, please let us know how it is in Colombia. What's going on there?
Thank you very much, Ignacio, and thank you for Jus Laboris for this invitation, and to all the panelists who are excellent and very professional labor and employment lawyers. In Colombia, and I think as we move towards the south, we start seeing that regulations from a labor and employment perspective, as opposed to what happens in the US and in Canada, are mostly central regulations. So whatever the central government dictates for this would be applicable to all the country. So in our case, we actually did have regulations in place, both for terminations and suspensions. But then locally and from the Ministry of Labor, they have been enacting some decrees and resolutions trying to advise employers what to do on this situation. It is important to take into account that, as you all know, the pandemic was declared by the World Health Organization on March 6th. And in Colombia, the government ordered a lockdown on the 24th of March. This means that it's been almost 8 months since we've been on a lockdown. This gave all employers a very, very small frame of time to prepare for this lockdown. Only essential activities were allowed to operate, so everyone had to somehow improvise and send everyone to work from home. So in this moment, the Ministry of Labor and the government, which main purpose is to preserve employment at all costs, they are advising against taking measures such as termination of employment or suspension of employment agreements. We did not go to the extreme that Argentina, for example, in which Ignacio is going to tell us later, to forbid terminations, for example. They are not forbidden, but they're strongly advised against. So the Ministry of Labor advises to go on the following order for employers to organize their workforce. The first measure would be to work from home or to telework. Two measures that are different, although similar, and that have created some confusion locally. Afterwards, then to grant employees vacations, either collective vacations or anticipated vacations, or even the ones that have been already been accrued but not taken. If you can have already gone from work from home and vacations and you still don't know what to do, then you can give your employees a paid leave of absence, which of course for employers is not a very practical measure, because they're still going to have to pay salaries without any type of operation going on. And when you're struggling with close of business, close of operations, no consumption, no commerce, and then you have employees that are still not allowed to work from home because the activity is not really prone to working from home. You have already granted vacations and you don't have enough cash to give them paid leaves of absence, then you have to go to those decisions such as terminating employment agreements or suspending employment agreements. In Colombia, we do have regulations related to massive layoffs, in which after you surpass certain threshold, you need a specific authorization from the Ministry of Labor. The Ministry of Labor said, I am not going to authorize any type of massive layoff right now. So employers were forced to go to voluntary terminations, voluntary termination plans, trying to agree with employees a way to terminate employment by mutual consent and granting them a special package so that they are not as affected as in a unilateral termination. Suspension, on the other hand, can be also agreed with the employee. Some employers try to allege that there was a force majeure to suspend employment agreement, something that has been discussed, whether this situation is force majeure or not. The main situation in these cases, whether there is a termination or there is a suspension of the employment agreement, is that from a constitutional point of view, if this decision is going to violate a fundamental right, meaning that the employee is going to be left in a situation of special vulnerability. They are not going to be able to survive, or their families to survive, then a constitutional court could order a reinstatement and payment of salaries just to preserve these fundamental rights. So it is important that whenever you take decisions, rather to terminate employment agreements or to suspend employment agreements, then you need to be careful that employees are not going to be left in a situation that could threaten or violate a fundamental right. Finally, there are some other alternatives, such as reducing salary or reducing working time and consequently salary. But as advised by the government, these situations can only be agreed individually with each employee. So you don't need collective agreements. You don't need, but you cannot take these decisions unilaterally. You need a mutual agreement with each individual employee. And I think this is a specific or a very general panorama of what's going on in Colombia, Ignacio, and I think we can go more to the south and see what's happening in Argentina.
Thank you so much, Catalina. Well, maybe why are we so back to this by the end of the world? We're so in the south. Well, we decided in Argentina since the end of last year we had a change in government. We have now back a Peronist government, and by the end of last year we already decided that we needed to apply double severance. So before the pandemic, before COVID, we have double severance in our regulations. Our regulation, which is centralized, as in Colombia, we have national labor legislation. We're a federal country, but regarding labor, we have federal law. And on the other hand, we like to regulate almost everything. However, half of our market is informal. So I will only discuss the formality, but you need to know that in Argentina, half of the market is in the informality. Once the pandemic started, very early in Argentina, we had a lockdown. We had our quarantine, which started on March the 20th. And a few days after, we decided that we were too rich and that we could have the privilege of forbidding terminations and forbidding suspensions. So companies were not allowed and are not allowed since March the 20th of terminating employees or unilaterally suspending the employees, which was the natural tool that our legislation had for this kind of situations. So what happened afterwards? Well, employers were allowed to move employees to telework, of course, in some industries and some activities that was good enough. And for some companies, the government put in force some kind of subsidy for the salaries of the employees. So whatever the employer was paying was the same or almost the same that the typical salary of the employee, with some discount on the social security taxes that are very expensive in Argentina, and with some help of the government in some cases. This could survive 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. However, we made it happen until now. We are still with all these regulations. Some employers are still receiving this assistance. Some companies are still not allowed to operate because of the lockdown of the economy. Others have opened. And we still have the prohibition of unilateral suspensions and of terminations. What are companies doing, to make it brief? Well, companies needed to restructure anyway, so many companies decided to go to voluntary separation programs. This is offering the employee to agree to leave the company and offering a generous package. There is an advantage in our system, macroeconomic system that's very unstable right now, is that people know that the value of the money today is much more than what it be in next month or next year. So many people were tempted to take these packages, these voluntary separation proposals, because they thought that the monies they could collect with the double severance in the basis of calculation and something extra that the company was giving them in order to convince them to leave would be better than what they could collect once the ban on terminations ends. On the other hand, the unions, you know, in Argentina, we have very strong unions, and this time, in my view, were quite responsible. So they negotiated with different, with the General Federation of Employers in Argentina and with different associations of employers, the possible suspensions by mutual agreement. So it's not unilateral by the employer, but it's suspensions agreed by the employer and the union, and agreed in some cases individually by the employee, where the employee gets something less than the regular salary, but knows that it has more chances of keeping the job after the provision ends. There's a procedure we have for mass layoffs, and this procedure was not technically eliminated by the government, but politically they decided that the Ministry of Labor will not open these procedures for the companies who intended to do massive layoffs, even if they said that they would occur after the prohibition ends. So there's like a practical impediment, a practical complication for companies who want to go in that direction, and the Ministry of Labor would not allow them even to negotiate with the union on that end. And finally, salaries. We have very high inflation in Argentina due to our instability from our macroeconomic, and salaries are negotiated with the unions at the national level, and most of those negotiations were quite reasonable. We are not matching inflation this year. We are lower than inflation, and they include some of what we call non-remunerative amount. It's some like assistance for the employee to get more money in the hand and less paid to Social Security in the middle of this crisis. So the company, the government, yes, allowed companies and employers in general to pay these amounts without Social Security taxes, even employers who are working because they were allowed to work during the lockdown. So I stick myself to time, which is not easy to control oneself. And now, if you agree, we can go back to Tara to know, Tara, what will be next in Canada? How do you imagine the next year when we hopefully have the vaccine, or we are out of COVID? What will the companies need to do, and how do you see the atmosphere?
Yeah, thank you. And I found your presentation on Argentina very interesting. So I think if you're an employer, you want to be in the US, and then after that, Canada or Colombia and Argentina. But if you're an employee, the other way around. So what we're looking at and starting to deal with is a bit of a flood on claims. So employees who are either challenging their layoff, and whether it was constructive dismissal or challenging their termination and litigating for severance packages, and also starting to see human rights complaints where employers may have attempted to force their employees back to work, childcare issues of family status discrimination where schools were not open, childcare, daycares were not open, and so parents of young children were unable to really come back to work if they were being required to, so that we're seeing that now. And I guess in the future we'll see also employees who really like working from home, who don't want to start coming back to the office. And I think we're starting to see a trend of people saying, no, I like how this works, and I want to keep working from home, and the challenges around that.
Thank you so much, Tara. Very, very interesting. And please, for all the audience, remember you can post your questions in the Q&A section. And Kia, what's next in the US regarding labor and employment still? You're muted, Kia.
Sorry, one of the new things we have to learn in the COVID world. Unmute yourself. So of course, much of what's going to happen in the future in the States is going to be tied up with the elections we just had a couple days ago. Some of the issues that we're going to face are there going to be extended benefits in the future for unemployment? And I didn't mention it in the beginning, but we did have pandemic unemployment insurance, basically extending unemployment insurance. And you had a weird situation where many employees, especially those who are making minimum wage or close to it, were actually getting more money staying home and being unemployed than coming back to work. And, that was becoming towards the end of summer, that was, really becoming a problem for businesses, because how do you get your employees to come back in? So, and
I comment on that as well.
Yeah.
employers in Canada, we're definitely seeing that as well with what we call the CERB, the emergency wage benefit. Exactly, if people were making more at home, and so that's been a challenge in Canada as well. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, absolutely, Tara, and that's been kind of a vigorous debate among Republicans and Democrats and in the federal government too, as to what we're going to do, and that's why one of the reasons why we haven't passed any additional legislation since, you know, the CARES Act back in whenever that was, March, at the end of March and April. So that's going to happen. Some type of legislation will happen, but what it says and what it provides for is kind of a toss-up, because when you look at both sides of the aisle here in the States as to what the Democrats want to do and, you know, what the Republicans want to do, they differ greatly. I think the Democrats, and certainly, Mr. Biden are going to want to try to, maybe try to funnel more money into schools and into infrastructure to make it easier for, the wheels to start working again. If we can get kids back into schools, then we can get parents back to work, and it kind of, the dominoes fall from there. Whereas the Republican side is very much, laissez-faire. It'll work itself out. The market will correct for this, and we'll keep going, and it's going to be all right. So I don't know. The future, we'll see what happens. But again, a lot is going to hinge on the results, which hopefully here in the U.S. we'll have in the next couple of days.
Thank you, Kia. Thank you very much. And Catalina, what's next in Colombia?
Well, the panorama is unclear and certainly not very promising. Our economy, as most economies, has been decreasing, and our unemployment rates are really skyrocket. We are exceeding 25% of unemployment and more than 70% of informal employment, which is something that is really worrisome, because these people are really not affiliated with the social security system. They are making money on a daily basis. So this is something that for right now is not really a very good situation. On the other hand, studies have shown that poverty has also increased in Colombia. We had tried to fight poverty in the last decade or decades, and now we are going backwards in that point. So many of the expectations from the government for the future are, for example, trying to modify our existing labor laws, trying to make it more flexible for employers to hire, to give formal employment contracts, trying to reduce labor costs, trying to define labor and benefits, salaries and benefits depending on the size of the company or even on the region where the company is located. However, we consider that those measures are going to be very difficult to pass, because as a result of all this economic situation that I just explained, well, the social movements have been really increasing, many protests, many strikes, and considering what's happening on the south of the continent, especially what happens in Bolivia, what's happening in Chile, this is probably something that is going to reflect in Colombia. And next year, we're going to see a lot of social movements, probably a moderate turn to the left. And this is going to make it very difficult for the government to try to pass regulations whereby salaries or benefits are somehow reduced. On the other hand, as Tara mentions, I think that working from home is a reality that is going to stay for many years. So I think that also modifying our current teleworking law and also regulating the special measure of working from home are necessary so that employers and employees are comfortable with this new reality. I think that summarizes what's being expected in Colombia for the next years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me tell you a little about what we foresee for Argentina. Well, we think the double severance, we had it from before COVID, and we will continue having probably completely next year. But regarding the ban on terminations and suspensions, we see it will be very difficult for the government to sustain that. First, because it's happening anyway in the informal market and partly in the formal market where companies are putting more money, and nobody is hiring new employees until this ends, even though the regulation does not apply to the new employees, to the new employment contracts. However, nobody would hire in that scenario. So we see it's likely it will definitely be extended to the end of this year, the prohibition on terminations, but we think that it might be released by the first quarter of next year. Next year, we have midterm elections for our government, so we'll be in the middle of a political crisis, of an economical crisis, and a social crisis, because the levels of unemployment will be very high. Now the government is measuring 14.4% of unemployment, but the level of activity of the Argentinian economy, it's very low. It's on this 38% where it should be on 45%. So many people aren't even going out to try to find a job. So that's why they're not counted as an employees, because they don't have an expectation of getting a job right now. So poverty will be higher. And since the government is very conscious about this, and that the situation for next year election will be very complicated for them, and they are negotiating right now with the International Monetary Fund to try to get some fresh monies in order to stabilize the economy. We think that there might be the case that we will have some amendments to the law in a way of a modality of hiring an employee, a modality of employment contract that will be promoted, will be especially flexible and especially cheap regarding social security and so on. We have been discussing with the government officers about this for some months, and they seem to be quite convinced that that's the only way in which some new jobs will be created, and in order to have the economic rebound, which will appear finally with job creation, because we can have economic rebound without formal job creation. So the government is quite conscious about this, and it seems convinced. On the other hand, we have a new telework law that's not being applied now, but was passed during the COVID pandemic. And this new telework law will be regulated in the future months. The law is very bad. It's really bad. It's too. It tends to be so protective to the employee that it takes out opportunities, because even though telework should come here to stay and should be in general terms a benefit for the employee, many companies will react against the law not applying telework because of the cost of this law. So we are waiting regarding this. We are waiting the regulation by the government, by the Ministry of Labor especially, where they might soften the impact of the bad telework law. And finally, from my side, we might see some intents of having a social agreement, a very broad social agreement between employers, the Confederation of Unions, and the government, in order to have some previsibility for the future and to reduce the conflictivity that if otherwise we would have because of poverty and because of the economical crisis. So we might have, like La Moncloa, like the Spanish agreement, we might have, we're discussing the possibility of having that kind of broad agreement in order to make the Argentinian miracle occur, because indeed we are in a very, very difficult situation right now, even though we have lots of opportunities, because as you know, Argentina is a rich country with a very high level of human resources, people very well prepared, good education, and so on. But it needs to rebuild confidence. Right now, all our crisis is explained because of the loss of confidence of our leading leaders from different stakeholders. So that's it from Argentina. I hope you haven't bored you about that. And we should now, if you agree, we should go to some Q&As, questions. We have a few questions from the audience. Please dare to post more questions. It will be very interesting for us to answer whatever you're thinking or having any comments from the audience. But I will start with one question I can see here. What have you heard about employment laws changing to a living wage in Canada? The AI Act was amended, so the payments would be the same that as the CERV. I hope I said it well. Some small businesses may have difficulty paying higher wages. Very, very Canadian question, I guess. So Tara, please let us know.
Interesting question. I'm hearing a lot about it, and it's not just from politicians kind of in the left in Canada. I am also hearing that discussion from the Conservative Party as well. And so traditionally, for those outside of Canada, there are minimum wage provisions in every province, and that's how the issue's been dealt with. But there's more and more debate about whether or not there should be just a living wage, a certain threshold set. So I think it's being debated. Certainly in Canada, I'm not sure elsewhere, but I defer to if that debate is going on in your jurisdictions as well.
Thank you very much, Tara. Kia, you already mentioned some expectations you have depending on who's winning the election, but would you like to go a little further in detail on what would you expect depending on if it's the Democrats or Trump staying as a Republican?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to do that. So if it's, the Republicans, I think we can probably expect what we've seen over the last 10 months. So, we would extrapolate that forward. As I said, I think even if the Republicans, remain, in power here, we will see some additional federal legislation. One thing that I think we're starting to see, and we'll probably see more of, especially if, there is this hands-off approach from the federal government moving forward, is you're going to start to see companies kind of shift their base of operations into states that are more laissez-faire. And so you have states, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but much of that would be, if you look in the South, their economy is doing pretty well comparatively to states maybe in on the coasts in the Northeast, where we have been locked down. So the economy is really grounded to a halt. So there's a bit of a calculus happening, right? If you have less restrictions, and if the federal government is not going to get involved here, and if the states are going to say, well, we're going to allow these businesses to reopen, and we're going to not put much impediments in front of them, you might see shifts where you're going to have more employees, more operations, more hubs start to move into those more friendly jurisdictions. So, for example, in New Jersey, they just the governor just passed an executive order last week, now having mandates for businesses to say you have to have a mask, you have to have breaks now for hand washing throughout the day. These are things that from a public health perspective are all good, and probably things that most businesses are already doing. But the thing that's different about this is now a mandate. And it's also tasking the State Department of Labor with really going hard after offenders and giving some, bite to it. Whereas everything you see from the federal government and the United States is always guidelines. It's guidance. So these are, very nice things we would like you to do, but there's no bite to it. So I think, again, if the Republicans remain in power, it's going to be much of the same. And if the Democrats get in and start to exercise more power, I think it will be more regulation, right? So we will start to have more things like perhaps these mandates, what businesses have to do, and if they don't do it, here's what the consequence is going to be. In addition to, as Tara might have mentioned a few minutes ago, we are going to see an avalanche of whistleblower claims, of lawsuits, of discrimination claims. That stuff has already started, and it's going to be coming. And one final thing I'll say, Ignacio, is there may be legislation. I think the Republicans are really pushing for this, would be some type of immunity for businesses, right? So if you had to do this, if you've taken these steps and you've been affected and you fit within this box, there's going to be this type of broad immunity that we're now going to pass over, so that it's going to be much harder for employees to bring lawsuits.
Thank you so much. For myself, I will just make a very short final comment. Is beware about discrimination claims in the future. The pandemic might might leave us many people who are what we say here it's population at risk because of age or illnesses they have and so on. And we are not sure if the vaccine will be effective for everybody or so on. And right now, those people are being taken out of the businesses, out of the company, saying you cannot work, you will still be paid, you cannot work because of the pandemic. However, when we are out of this, will that people be allowed to work? Will people be willing to work with them and so on? And will we have a tension between the workers who had or have COVID, even with the vaccine, and people who have any particular situation of risk who are not being hired by certain companies and so on, or people who left the companies by agreements right now in Argentina, for instance, who say, okay, now I cannot get a new job. I did not know what the impact of COVID was, and that I was not going to be allowed to be rehired. And why don't you rehire me right now if many people are being hired in your company and you're not hiring me because I'm more than 50, 60 or so on, or because I have asthma or so on. So this is it. Thank you very much, Kia, Tara, Catalina, and thanks for the audience. And Annie, please, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Ignacio. So we have now reached the end of this session, but the Legal HR Summit is not over yet, as we have other sessions coming up today. So on your screens, you can see the titles of the next 2 simultaneous sessions. If you wish to join, you can register on the legalhrsummit.com. The event page. I have sent the link in the chat. Even if you cannot attend, you can still register and we will email you the recording after the event. Finally, also from my side, I would like to thank everyone for attending this session, and thanks also to our panelists for their important insights. So with that, this session will now be ending. I hope to see you at the next one.